Peter, the apostle to the Jews, being rebuked by Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles. Because he had a ham sandwich. That's right. In verse 118, Paul introduced Peter into the epistle. He brought him in again in 2:7, 2:8, and 2:9, calling him Cephas in verse 9. The naming of Peter and the words used to describe him were not without specific intent. Instead, that intent now begins to be realized. Paul will show that his gospel message is correct by showing how Peter, one of the great pillars of the church, which we just had identified, actually departed from it. Thus, the correction was to be made in him, not in Paul. Okay, having said that, because Paul is correcting Peter on his gospel presentation, what does that mean? I mean, it's explicit. Even though you have to infer it, it means that it is the same gospel presentation. That's correct. There is not two gospels. There is one. There is a dispute between some texts as to whether the name Peter or Cephas was originally used in verse 11. Both refer to the same individual, and so it doesn't change the overall intent, but probably Paul used Cephas here. This would be to tie him back to his Jewish name and identity. Anytime you see a person's name changed, it's for a reason, okay? He called him Peter, and all of a sudden he says Cephas. Why would he do that? It's because he is now going to refute him in front of the Judaizers in his writing. And so he's using his Hebrew name, Cephas, or whatever Aramaic name, instead of his Greek name. Okay, so they both mean the same thing. Peter is the rock, Cephas is the rock. It means the same thing, but one is one language, one is another. Okay, this would be to tie him back to his Jewish name and identity, which is then a connection to the entire intent of this passage. Either way, though, he begins with, now, when Peter had come to Antioch. This was probably shortly after Paul's visit to Jerusalem and the council's decision, which was rendered in Acts chapter 15. Antioch was in a Gentile area and counted many Gentiles among the rolls of the church. While there at Antioch, Peter's actions, which will be explained, necessitated Paul to withstand him to his face. In other words, there would be a dispute which required an open admonishment because of a failure to adhere to the gospel. As Paul says, because he was to be blamed. Now, this isn't just something that I'm just remembering this for a curious reason. He's remembering it because this is as important as any other point that I bring it up I brought it up 5 times already today. No law. That is the whole point of what he is saying. If you reintroduce the law, as he will say later in the book of Galatians, you have fallen from grace. You are a debtor to the entire law. This is why he's bringing this up right now. The word for blamed here is kataginosko, and it is more appropriately translated as condemned. The actions of Peter brought about their own condemnation. The explanation of the thought is actually clearly given by Paul in chapter 5. Let me take you there and I'll read you what it says. Chapter 5, verse 2. Indeed, I, Paul, say to you, I just said it a second ago, that if you become circumcised, Christ will profit you nothing. And I testify again to every man who becomes circumcised that he is a debtor to keep the whole law. You have become estranged from Christ. You who attempt to be justified by law, you have fallen from grace. And that is what he is saying about Peter right now. Peter, who had been with Jesus the entire time, who had seen everything that could possibly be seen, that had been given as much grace as any person that ever existed because he turned his back on Peter 3 times and then was restored as an apostle. Peter should have known better. What?
Back on Jesus.
Yeah, that's what I said, didn't I?
You said turned his back on Peter.
Peter turned his back on Jesus 3 times. Okay, yeah. Well, if I said, yeah, okay. Thank you. All right. He turned his back on the Lord 3 times, and yet he was restored. Thank you. If I said that, that's my mental dyslexia catching up on me. Anyway, that's why this is so important, is because we have to make absolutely sure that we understand that there is no law involved in our salvation or in our continued life in Christ. No law. If we reintroduce the law, we have fallen from grace and we are a debtor to the whole law. And that is how God will see us. That does not mean that we will lose our salvation, but that is how God will see us. From that point on, When we walk away from the grace of God in Christ, well, I'm going to start attending a Hebrew roots movement church, and I'm going to start observing these because the rabbi there says that I have to do that. From that point on, your rewards will be zero. You will get no rewards from the Lord ever because you are trying to live out what Christ has already done for you. And that's what Paul is saying. You're a debtor to the whole law. Because you can't meet the whole law, you cannot be rewarded by God. You will not lose your salvation, but you will get no reward from the Lord for anything you do after that point. You have rejected the cross of Christ. Go ahead.
He said he